Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on in Unit 2 with our discussion on population, and specifically now we're talking about migration. There is a particular topic that seems to be important to the College Board, and they want to be a part of the course and a part of the test, and that's going to be what they call the 3 migration waves to the United States. Now the reason this is important is because in order to understand really the characteristics, mainly the cultural characteristics of the United States, one of the very first things we want to look at is you can look at the different groups of people who migrated to the United States. Look at some of the different places where they migrated to within the United States. You can see how it is that those groups of people influenced the landscape, influenced the culture, influenced the economy, and all those kinds of things. So you can see there, historically they group geographers group the migration waves into 3 particular time periods, and the first one we have is called the Colonial Era. Then we'll look very briefly at the 19th and the 20th century, and then we'll talk about the late 20th century. So the very first period that we look at when we talk about migration waves to the United States, we have what's called the Colonial Era. The reason it's called the Colonial Era is because this is the period when European countries were colonizing the United States, what would eventually become the United States. And so, of course, you have the initial movement of people to the Americas, and you also, of course, have the conflict that would have arisen between the colonizers and the native people on the landscape. So, the period that they use is from 1607 to 1776. And if you think about it, 1776 is the year that we have the end of the colonial era, because that's when the American Revolution begins. If we look at who is coming to the United States at this particular time, most people are going to be coming from Europe and from parts of Africa. So if we look at the Europeans were primarily coming from Western Europe. Specifically, we could talk about England, and we could talk about places like the Netherlands, and you could also talk about Spain, depending on what part of the United States you were looking at. And of course, we don't want to forget about the French. So some of the main reasons why Europeans were coming over is you did, of course, have those who were facing elements of religious persecution. You had the Puritans who were living in England, who were of a particular Protestant grouping of Christianity that was not necessarily welcome in England, because the official church in England was the Anglican Church, and it was illegal to be a part of any other religion because of the conflict that really Europe had undergone for the last several hundred years. And so the Puritans were experiencing religious persecution, so several groups of them wanted to come over to the United States. Some people just wanted to come over and start a new life. Maybe there were elements of economic gains to be had, and so you had some who were coming over for that, especially if you look at things like the Virginia colony, with, of course, the story of Pocahontas and John Smith, people coming over to find gold, but instead they found tobacco, and of course the hardships that they faced in those particular elements. Early on, you had the Carolinas, which were founded by 8 wealthy Englishmen to try and create some economic activities, growing rice and some indigo and things along those lines. The Dutch founded New Amsterdam, which would eventually become New York. Very prosperous trading center. So again, really lots of different situations. You had the Spanish that colonized Florida, and that was, of course, mainly just an extension of the Spanish Empire at the time, trying to take over new territory. Of course, God, Gold, and Glory is the theme that we talk about in terms of the reasons why the Spanish were coming and conquering new territory in the New World. Then, of course, you have the Africans. Africans mainly coming from West Africa, the West African trading states and empires that were along the western coast of Africa, mainly the northwestern coast. This is where the Europeans would go to participate in the slave trade. The African kings who were living near the coast would go and they'd capture people from rival tribes. They would bring them and they would trade them to the Europeans, and the Europeans then would in turn bring them to the New World for slave labor, primarily in agricultural pursuits. So you have these main groups of people are coming. They're mainly colonizing the eastern coast, and of course Depending on where you're talking about on the eastern seaboard, you begin to find different cultural groups coming, and of course, which is going to lead to different histories. You look at the different economic activities that were taking place, primarily trade and things like that in the north, whereas you had agriculture in the south. And depending on where the Africans were at, you had some important elements to culture that they added as well, especially things like the cooking and the different ways that they would express themselves through song and those kinds of things. So this is what we call the colonial era. Again, they're settling the eastern seaboard, um, and that's what's going to help us to understand kind of the beginnings of the settling of the United States. If we move on to the 19th and the 20th century, so we're talking about the 1800s and the 1900s, we see several things going on. First, we have immigrants coming from Ireland and Germany, and some of the main reasons they're coming from these places. In Ireland, you had the potato famine that took place, and so not only do you have people who are starving and looking for new opportunities, but you also have poor farmers in Ireland who had lost their farms to their English landlords because they were not able to pay rent because their potato crop had failed, and so they were not able to make any money for several years, and so they were forced to leave. So many of them came to the United States, and a lot of them were settling in the northeastern United States, finding their way into some of the factory towns and the factory cities that were beginning to pop up in the United States. In Germany, you had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. You had people who were looking for new opportunities because you had a population increase in Germany, so there was less land available for farmers and things, so many of them began to come to the United States. Many of the Germans began settling some of the Midwestern, the mid and the central states, kind of the north-central places along like Ohio, Minnesota, places along those lines. And then in our post-Civil War era, 1865 and on, you had a lot of them coming from Russia and Hungary. You had turmoil in both of those places. In Russia, um, you had some poverty taking place, and eventually we'll look at you have the communist revolution take place in Russia. You had the breakup of Austria-Hungary, and so a lot of immigrants coming from there because of some of the religious turmoil and things taking place, plus also communist revolution taking place in that part of the world. So a lot of them started coming to the United States looking for a new start. And then in our last portion, we'll look at the late 20th century, and we can break it down into to two different sets of dates. You have the 1970s and 1980s. In this particular period, you really see a lot of immigrants coming from Asia. Again, you had several communist revolutions taking place. You had one taking place in Vietnam. You had a communist revolution take place in Cambodia, causing a lot of people to try and come to the United States to get away from some of the violence and things that were taking place. And then the 1980s on, you had a lot of folks coming from Latin America, of course, settling in places like Texas and other parts of the western portion of the United States that were once a part of the Mexican Empire. And a lot of them are coming because at this particular time because of the relative prosperity of the United States and also the relative closeness of the United States to Latin America in relationship to the lack of economic opportunity in Latin America. And so a lot of people in Latin America, because there really was no opportunity for them, and because of the relative closeness to the United States, they began moving to the United States to try and look for jobs and look for opportunities for themselves to improve their livelihood. And so that's all we have for today. So again, just a short discussion on the what are considered the three migration waves to the United States. Now, obviously during this period there are a lot of other people coming to the United States, coming from other places, but these are recognized as some of the main groups that began coming to the United States, and some of the places that they settled. And again, it can be kind of a lead into a discussion on how does that impact the culture and the character of those particular places. When we come back next time, we'll look at U.S. migration policy and in consideration of how these different migration waves impact American migration policy through time.